individuality, they're trying to understand it. We do recognize that people come in very different beings, as it were. So that's our beginning. Whoops, I just dropped. Sorry, I dropped my paper. So the next thing I want to look, and then we're going to go right into marriage. So in Bereshit, it follows in chapter 2, verse 18, God says, Lo tov hayom ha'adam levado. Right? It's not good. We've all heard this verse. It's not good for ha'adam, this being, to be alone. And I will make an ezer kenegdo. I will make a fitting helper, is the translation that's used here. There's actually no great translation for ezer kenegdo. Ezer means a helper. So a helper, a partner, someone who will be with this being, but kenegdo means opposite from him. So on the one hand, we have a helper. On the other hand, neged means in opposition. It's not just physically standing apart from the other person, but actually being in opposition. And anyone who's ever been in a relationship, whether it's a marital relationship, a romantic relationship, or a friendship, anything, knows sometimes you get along and sometimes you're butting heads. And that's just the way it is. And interestingly, that's really the definition of ezer kenegdo. If everything is perfect all the time, there's probably something lying under the surface that you're not sharing. And we see that in psychology and all sorts of areas, not just in our text here. Right? And so God then, as our story continues, God puts Adam to sleep, and much like in the symposium, God splits Ha'adam, this being, into Adam and Chava, to Adam and Eve, and the idea, and then the flesh is closed up, just as the symposium says, and then Apollo closed up the flesh, where the split occurred. And our text goes on saying, so it's man cleaves to the woman, as if searching for that second half, that other piece that was missing. So that is the basis in Judaism for why we should seek marriage and why we should seek to have another person, because that person is going to be physically, in a way, a completion of who we are, but at the same time, that person is not just a positive completion. There are going to be times when we are at odds with that person, with that second half, with that other piece. And so that leads us to the nature of who we are as human beings and the nature of desire. If we continue to look through that, sorry, I'm just going to find my next source, which I actually printed my sources earlier today and then moved things around. And so not wanting to waste another 7 pages of paper, I just numbered them rather than reprinting. So the next question is, of course, what do we do? What do we do in terms of finding our other half? There's this lovely idea in Judaism called beshert, which means it's like meant to be. Right? The idea of a soulmate. Now, depending on who you ask, there's a possibility for more than one soulmate, right? The rabbis understood that sometimes, for whatever reason, a marriage might end, even if it seems like it was beshert in the beginning. Sometimes it may be beshert, and there was a purpose for that marriage, and then for some reason that purpose is fulfilled, and for some reason the marriage will end, or marriages end because someone passes away, someone dies, and then there is another beshert. There can be another beshert. So it's not the idea of soulmates. There is one person in this world, and that only that one person in this world can make you happy, but rather there are many opportunities to find something that is meant to be. And that's used not just with romantic love, but with all sorts of other opportunities, with jobs, with houses, with children, all sorts of things. You'll hear people who like the word beshert say, oh, whatever happened, that's beshert. That's the way it happened. That's the way it was supposed to happen, or that was all for the best. And so we have this idea, but where does it come from? So looking back at those texts of Breshit, of Genesis, we have the commentary on that, Genesis Rabbah, Breshit Rabbah, which is Midrash, the stories that give us explanation behind the text. And we have this great story of a Roman matron asking Rabbi Yossi ben Halafta, in how many days did God create the earth? And he says, it's 6. And then he gives her a quote. She says, yeah, and 6, since God created the earth, what's your God been doing? If you think about the Roman gods, they're a lot more active in the world, not always in a positive way, but they're a lot more active in the world. And so she's challenging him, what's your God doing? You say your God's so powerful, what's your God doing? And Yossi ben Halafta says, our God has been making marriages. That's the greatest thing that can happen. Our God is Yenta the matchmaker. And she's like, I can do that. Making marriages is nothing. And she takes her slaves and she says, this one will be with that one, and this one will be with that one. And she matches them all up. And his response to her is, though this may be an easy thing for you to do, for God, it's as difficult as splitting the Sea of Reeds. And then he left. He walks away. So the next day, the matron has her slaves coming to her, and it says, this one had his head bashed in, and another had lost an eye, and a third was hobbling around. And she wants to know, what happened here? And the answers, and this is an interesting image of slavery, because it's very different than, say, the images we have of modern slavery or Black slavery, that they spoke up to her. I don't want this one. You gave me this one. This is not the one I want. I don't want to be with this one. And the other one, I don't want to be with that one. And so there were fights to the point of violence. And she summons Rabbi Yossi to her and says, your God is not like our God, and your Torah is true. And you spoke wisely. Like, it's not so easy. She does what the Roman gods do and kept playing in people's lives, but then chaos ensues, which is also, of course, true in a lot of the Roman mythology. And so for us, matching someone up is a divine job, right? And so much so that there's a tradition that if you set up 3 couples in your lifetime, that your place in the world to come is absolutely ensured, right? Just 3, not a lot, but that it's such a hard thing to do, that if you could do 3, you belong in the world, up in the world to come. You have that blessing. So that just tells us how marriages get started. That just tells us what we should do. It's really a question in terms of how to have a good marriage. And we have a joke in our house. Our ketubah hangs over our bed. It's actually, I mean, I can see it because I'm sitting in our room. I can see it right now. And in the ketubah says that a husband, the ketubah is very one-sided. There's some wonderful work out there now to create much more egalitarian marriage within the conservative movement. But that ketubah says in there somewhere, I can't quite see it from here, but says that that Sean should act in the way of Jewish husbands throughout the generations. That's open to a lot of interpretation, right? So, it comes up with things like, could you change the litter, the kitty litter? It's like, do I have to do it? Well, yeah, it's the way of Jewish husbands throughout the generations, right? We'll throw that out. But it also comes up with things like me saying, did you have to make that joke? And he says, of course I did. It's the way of Jewish husbands throughout the generations. So, we've used it as a bit of a joke back and forth. But there are reasons that it's there, right? There are ideas that exist in our traditions of how a Jewish spouse is supposed to exist and function, right? As outside of a Jewish spouse, our traditions don't really care. They're only addressing the Jewish community. So heading back to Breshit, and if you're looking at the sources, it's source number 9. In Breshit, after the death of Sarah, Isaac marries Rivka, and our text says, and he took Rebekah as his wife, and he loved her, and he brought her into his mother's tent, and he found comfort after his mother's death. And the commentary on that says that this actually comes from actions that she did, right, that were the missing in Isaac's life, right? Basic actions, like when Sarah was alive, there was a light burning in her tent, right? And the text looks at it again from a very gendered point of view. There was a light burning in her tent. There was always her dough, the dough that she made for bread was always blessed. It always rose beautifully, right? And there was a cloud over the entrance to her tent. So it wasn't there. The cloud in Genesis, in Breshit, represents God. So there's a divine connection there. So if we hear people, if we hear background noise, we'll end up muting you. So if I mute you, that's the reason. So, excuse me. So the idea that what do we provide to our spouse? We provide comfort, but we also do things that, what was missing from Isaac's life wasn't just the presence of his mother, but the things she did. That she was the one who made sure that there was food for him, that she was the one that, that there was a light burning all the time. And light in our tradition represents learning and teaching, and connection to our text. And so when he lost that, it's not just that he lost his mother, but he lost these things that sustained him. And so when we get married, one of the things we do is we take whatever those sustaining actions or objects were from our family before we were married, and we hope that in our marriage provides those items. So in this case, in ancient times, we're talking about light, which is very important, and bread, which is very important, and a connection to God. In more modern times, those things might look very different, right? We're going to talk about food and shelter are still there, but also friendship, which is not something that I think ancient texts really understood, but we understood it today. Although Isaac and Rebekah, they're probably our only real love match. Interestingly, we talk a lot about Jacob seeing Rachel and falling in love with her and working for 7 years, and isn't that wonderful? But if you look at the actual relationship, he works for 7 years for her, but then afterwards we don't see a lot of interaction. Whereas Isaac and Rebekah, we see that they love each other. We see them interact in our text. When Isaac says to Pharaoh, this is my sister, not my wife, following in his father's footsteps. You'd think he would have learned, his father did it twice. You'd think he would have learned the lesson. Then they're found out because the two of them are playing around, whatever that means between the married couple. They're playing around in the garden, and they're seen. And it's obvious in watching the two of them interact. And it could have been sexually, but it could have also been that intimacy that isn't necessarily sexual, but that you see in a married couple, right? And it was obvious to whoever saw them that they were more than, that they were not brother and sister, that they were more than just friends, that they were a married couple. Years ago, we had we had some friends, and I remember saying to Sean, we had been with them for dinner, and afterwards I said, you know, I'm concerned about them because they're not they're not in each other's space, right? They're not touching each other. Married people, even if it's just if you're sitting down and you walk by and someone will put a hand on the shoulder of the other. Um, People move, married couples move in each other's space, or people in relationships move in each other's space, and they were very much apart. And you could see the issues that were going on, even though all the words were civil, whatever they said seemed right. You know, there was nothing except that one piece. And lo and behold, not too long after, they separated. And so that intimacy that Isaac and Rebecca have, that's our goal. That's our love match in the Bible. And that's the only time that we really see true love. Jacob falls in love with an image of Rachel. He sees her, he falls in love with her, but he doesn't know who she is. Isaac falls in love with Rebecca, with who she is. And so that's really, really important because it's how we relate to our spouses. But that doesn't really help us. That's great if you can fall in love and you can find that friend, and it doesn't really help us. What does it take though to keep that marriage alive, to have a good Jewish marriage? So we're gonna talk a little bit about the mitzvah of Nida and mikvah, which is, I will be honest, which is my favorite mitzvah. Whether you observe it or not, you may have different feelings about it, but it's definitely my favorite among all of the mitzvot. I'll explain to you for personal reasons and marital reasons. I'll explain to you why when we get there. Also, sexually, what's allowed, and then we'll get to Sean's commandments because time goes very quickly in our discussion. So first, if you let me just find that. If you're looking at sources, source 11. Source 11 is a text from the Talmud, Masechet Nida. So Nida is the portion that deals with the issues of menstruation and separation between husband and wife. And there is this tradition that when a woman is menstruating, that she would be tameh, which is often translated as impure, usually translated as impure. I actually like to translate it as taboo because it's impure implies an uncleanness, whereas taboo, the reason is more connected to holiness and loss of life force. There are blood and semen are the things that make you tameh personally. They are seen as a loss of life, potential life force from the body. And so when you're losing them, that's when you come into this impure state. It's not because you're somehow dirty or bad, but it's connected to the holiness of what might have been. So biblically, it's all about purity, ritual purity, and ritual impurity. By the time we get to the Talmud, and the Talmud is codified, which is about the 6th century, the whole reason for Nida has changed. The whole reason we use mikvah. So it used to be if anytime a man ejaculated, he was supposed to go to mikvah because it's a loss of that life force. So anytime a woman menstruated, she was losing that life force, and then after would go to mikvah. Or after she gave birth, and with birth there's also a lot of blood. After she gave birth, she would go to mikvah. But by the time we reach the Talmud, first of all, men are not always going to mikvah, and women have taken on this whole other meaning behind the idea of menstruation. First of all, it was initially, now please remember again, Talmud is written by men, and once in a study session about Nida, I, after a couple of hours of studying, burst out with, If they would only have spoken to their wives for about 10 minutes, we could have a very different conversation. But that being said, the rabbis assumed that a period lasted 5 to 7 days. Depends on if you are from one tradition or another. 5 to 7 days. There's no real discussion about the reality of are you actually having your period or not having your period. They just put a number on it and went forth from there. Just fine. So first they say, um, what is the reason that a woman is prohibited from having intercourse with her husband during these 7 days? And then they say, well, if a couple, let me find the spot, if a couple will separate, it's so that when she becomes pure again, she will be as enticing to her husband. Here they have the translation they have is dear. She'll be as dear to her husband as the time when she entered the wedding canopy, when she entered the chuppah. And so it moves not so much from purity and impurity to rather, if you can separate, it's a absence makes the heart grow fonder idea. If you can separate from each other, then when you come back, you'll be more interested. Now, that may or may not be true. It doesn't work for every couple, obviously. But interestingly, studies have shown that couples who observe niddah on some level, and there are those who observe it biblically who say that during a period they won't engage in sexual activity. And then, of course, how each couple defines sexual activity is personal and different. And it can go from anywhere from simply meaning intercourse to, in many traditions, the more Haredi traditions, not even handing each other something. So the Talmud talks about, I didn't even hand my husband or my wife a key because you might touch, you might have contact when you hand something small from one person to another. So, they won't even hand things to each other, including, a child. So a child, if you're holding a child will be put down and then picked up by the other parent. So we have this very wide range of what it means to observe niddah. But within that wide range, we have studies that show us that those who observe niddah do tend to be more sexually intimate than couples who do not observe niddah. And the reasons that the studies come up with, that they look at what people say, the reasons they come up with out of that is when you're conscious of the fact that 50% of the time, and those 7 days were made into 7 more days at the time of the Talmud, which is attributed to women adding on 7 more days, not men imposing it upon them. It's impossible for us to know the reality. But when you are conscious of the fact that you may not be able to be intimate, then you are much less likely to say, I'm very tired tonight. There are nights you're going to be tired. Totally fair. But at the same time, it's very easy, especially now when the days are just the same, every single day is the same, to get involved in binge watching whatever show you're watching on Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever state streaming system you're watching, and to fall asleep instead watching your whatever show or reading your book or doing whatever, because every day becomes the same. But if you're observing niddah, it's much more important to be aware of what the dates are, when you might become niddah, how long you're going to be niddah, and what you'll be prevented from enjoying during that time. And so couples are more likely to say things like, yeah, to themselves and possibly to each other. Yeah, I'm kind of tired, but I'm likely to get my period in 2 days. So, or yes, I'm tired, but you're likely to be niddah in 2 days. So let's not lose this opportunity. And taking opportunities, I think, are what really makes a marriage work. And that's not just a Jewish marriage. That's, of course, any marriage at all. Now, moving on from the opportunities to be intimate. And I will say, now my kids are all in university, but when Gavi was born, it's not always so easy. And I know that I'm in a very different stage of life than other people on this call. When my children were younger, right after Gavi was born, I was speaking. I'd gone for my first checkup with our midwife. We were in the my husband was on active duty in the military at the time, and so the person I was seeing was a midwife, and I went to Major Harvey, who was my midwife, and she said, we need to talk about birth control. I always talk about birth control at this first checkup. And I looked her in the eye, and Gavi was our second child, and I said, well, for the first 6 months, I plan on using exhaustion, right? And that was it, right? And, she laughed, but she also said to me, I know you're only half joking. I also know you have an older child. And I said, but seriously, seriously, Gavi is a good sleeper. We have plans on having more children. And so I'm not really so concerned about birth control at that time. But the joke there, the understanding that, yes, for 6 months, I had a newborn baby, there was not going to be a tremendous amount of sexual intimacy, whether because the baby was going to interrupt, because children were going to knock at the door, because someone was going to be usually Sean would be putting Jesse to sleep and fall asleep in Jesse's bed. Jesse would not be asleep, just Sean. All of that affects the ability of a couple. But it's also important to remember to take those moments and grab them when you can, because at some point, those kids do grow up. They do go off to university or to trade school or move out, get jobs. Sometimes they don't move out. If it's COVID, they're in your basement, and you're going to be a couple. So it's not just that we're parents. And we forget that, because especially in Judaism, we talk so much about the importance of having children. And we focus so much on the importance of having children and on creating another generation and on Pruavu, that we forget to talk about the fact that Judaism has always seen marital intimacy, sexual intimacy, as a positive thing, as something that's important and vital to a relationship. And unlike Christianity, where there is this idea of original sin that's related to sex and the knowledge of it, and it comes back to how they treat those first few verses when human beings are created, we don't have that. And so sex is definitely not just for procreation. The laws of Nida definitely aid most people in getting pregnant, although not all, because we, of course, now know that people can ovulate earlier or later. And so sometimes the laws of Nida can actually get in the way. And if that's true, couples need to know that and be able to observe them differently. But there's the idea, if you have 2 weeks, there's a week where you are likely fertile, but there's a week where you're not likely fertile. And Judaism still says couples should be enjoying each other's intimate company. That it's not only, well, it's for procreation. And that means during pregnancy, couples should be intimate. And that means if couples cannot have children, that they should still be intimate, because there's an understanding that intimacy helps the relationship be maintained. To look at another text from the Talmud, in Arim is the Masachet, it says that a woman actually came to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and she was concerned because And there's a lot of euphemistic language here. She says, Rabbi, I set a table and he turned it over. So the implication, as it's understood in the text, is she was ready to have sex with her husband, missionary style, and he wanted her to turn over. And Yehuda Hanasi, and this we're talking about the 6th century, and earlier when this gets codified, says the Torah permitted any manner of engaging in sexual intercourse, even if it's atypical, which is important because now we're back to the idea that sex is not just for procreation in Judaism. If sex is only for procreation, then you should only have vaginal intercourse. But if sex is for intimacy, then as long as a couple is interested, and consent is very important, the Talmud recognizes that there can be such a thing as marital rape. Our society couldn't figure that out until the 70s, right? At least legally, but the Talmud figured that out. At the same time, if you are two consenting adults, and if there is this idea that it should be within marriage, but if you're two consenting adults, then you should be able to enjoy whatever you enjoy as long as no one's getting hurt, right? You're both agreed upon this. And so the next thing I'll say is one thing that's important that I've heard teachers who talk about Nida and who do Kala classes, so wedding classes for women or rooms classes, will say, you don't want to talk about this too much. But there's a movement in the more right-wing arms of Judaism, and certainly in those who are more left-wing, that couples need to be able to talk about sex and intimacy. And that means often awkward conversations, uncomfortable conversations. And I'll tell you, it doesn't matter how long you're married. If someone decides they're interested in something, it's still going to be awkward. And there should be a lot of, there's no problem with there's a lot of giggling and silliness and awkward moments. But to be able to speak with your spouse about anything that you're interested in, and say, would you be interested? Not in a demanding way, but are you interested in doing this or trying something out? And a respect that allows for these conversations to occur. So I know, as I said, that the Talmud recognized that marital rape was possible. There are rules. So the text I included on the source sheet is from the early 19th century, but it's the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which is a law code, but it goes back to the ideas that are put in the Talmud and puts them together. And it says, one should not have intercourse with his wife unless she has a desire. And certainly one is forbidden to force her. And no one should have intercourse with his wife if he hates her or if she hates him. If she tells him she does not want his attention. So as much as it's important to have that marital intimacy, it's also okay to actually have a headache at night. If she does not consent to having cohabitation, if he's decided to divorce her, but hasn't told her yet, he's not allowed to cohabitate with her, even though he doesn't hate her in that case. And no one should be with his wife while she's actually asleep, nor while he or she are intoxicated. So consent is something that at least we could say consent is something our text got right. They can't always say that every individual got it in our history got it right, but our text understood that consent was a very important piece of having a loving and respectful relationship. Because if you don't have that, then how can you in times when people aren't drunk or are willing, how can you balance that? Because you're going to lose respect for each other if you cannot have those conversations. Right. So I want to look at one other text that is from Rambam. I have a difficult relationship with Rambam. Rambam is a great scholar, and for his time, right? So Rambam lived in the 12th century. Rambam, for his time, uh, in many ways, is very advanced, but I personally think Rambam is a bit of a prude. And I think our texts are much more adventurous than Rambam is willing to give credit to. And I don't know what it was, not knowing Rambam personally, I can't know what it was in his life that made him this way, but Rambam was very limited. At the same time, in the Mishnah Torah, he wrote an entire section on marriage, and he says a man should, and I'd like to say this as think of this as a spouse. But he says, excuse me, a man should honor his wife more than himself and love her as much as himself. He should use his money for her benefit according to what he can afford. Please remember, at this time, of course, any money would have been held by the male partner in the relationship, right? Women weren't really permitted to own property in most places. He should not inspire great fear in her, and he should speak gently with her, and he should be neither depressed nor hot-tempered. And on the flip side, a woman should honor her husband more than he deserves and have awe of him, enact all of her actions according to his word. He should seem to her like a minister or a king, walking in the desires of his heart and distancing herself from what he hates. He goes, this is how holy and pure Jews behave in their marriages, and these paths should be their pleasant and praiseworthy lifestyle. And while, of course, Rambam's language is very gendered, it's not a bad model for thinking about how we relate to spouses, right? It's very hard to always be in awe of a person whose laundry you might do, right? I think there are realities in life that lead us to not always do all of these things. But if we can keep some of them in our minds, then hopefully we can build towards a better relationship. And sometimes if we can keep the text ideas, not necessarily the text in our minds, but the ideas in our minds, then sometimes we can hear ourselves when we're not really fulfilling our end of the bargain, as it were, right? And looking at this, I'll be honest, looking at this, a woman should honor her husband more than he deserves. Well, hopefully, if you have a positive relationship, both spouses should deserve, all the honor that the other one can give. That is not to say that, sometimes there won't be arguments. There will be. And a very important part of maintaining a good relationship is learning how to fight. One of my favorite stories I tell, and Sean knows that I share this story, is when we were married a year and a half or so, I think it was, because I think we were back from Israel and we spent our first year of marriage in Israel. We were having an argument about something, and I come from a family that yells. We yell, we're loud, but we get, we yell, we get it out of our system, and then we move on. And that's fine. Sean comes from a family where everyone keeps everything inside because it's more fun that way. And so he was done fighting. He was just done. When I was yelling, he was done. And he's like, I'm done. And then started to walk out of the room. And I said to him, you can't leave. I'm not done yelling. It wasn't even, I'm not done with this argument. I just wasn't done yelling. The argument wasn't important anymore. I had to be able to get this out so that I would be done with it. And at some point after that comment, we started laughing because we realized we didn't really, the argument wasn't really the important piece. What was important is discovering in that moment that we had two totally different ways of having an argument. And not that we have it down perfect. I mean, we've been married 27 years and we still don't have it down perfect. But that realization in that moment brought up a lot of laughter. And it's something we return to because sometimes we're in the midst of an argument and you can see it gets more and more heated, and we realize that we're actually going in different directions because not because of the argument, but because we have different ways of fighting. And anything you can do to be self-aware like that is really important, because those are the things, those self-aware moments when then you can sit back and you go, that was ridiculous. Like the fight's essentially over, but I have 5 more minutes of yelling before I can be done. Are those moments when you can say, okay, I now understand why you can't listen to this anymore. And to be honest, the way our arguments work, Sean just turns off at some point because he knows I got to just finish yelling, but he's going to be done. So he's learned to turn off, and I've learned not to worry about the fact that he's turned off, and then we can just finish the explosive getting the yelling out, and then we can have a normal adult conversation. And that won't work for everybody. That works for us. But it's the type, as an example of the type of thing that people need to discover within their relationship. And that's something that, like I said, we're married 27 years, we're still discovering new pieces because we also all evolve continuously. So always be on the lookout for those little moments so that we can kind of be in awe of each other, that we can try to give a little more to our spouse than he or she thinks they deserve, right? It's not, I think you deserve X, but I'm going to give you X plus 10. I'm not even going to think about what you deserve, because you deserve everything. You deserve 110% from me all the time, but I also deserve 110%. And if we try to give that 110% on those days where we are too tired, on those days where we are frustrated, and especially now, we've all been on top of each other in our homes constantly every single day for coming up on a year. That can be especially difficult. I want to look at, and I'm going to send the recording. I think the beginning of it is missing, but I'm going to send the recording with the source sheet, the link to the source sheet, but also to Sean's blog. And I want to give you his rules of marriage as we're running out of time. So as I said, he developed these rules of marriage when we were probably married, let's see, less than a decade. And he was starting to come up with these because he was doing a lot of marriage counseling at the time. Just he was on active duty with the US military, and there are a lot of very young people who are married in the military. People they're 18 and 19 years old, and they're doing difficult jobs, and jobs that the military spouse is taken away for long periods of time, right? And so marriage isn't easy. And marriage is never easy. Marriage isn't meant to be easy. Marriage is meant to be something that you want to work at. But if you're not together, it can become even harder. And that's something that during COVID, I keep hearing from people, or from someone who's here, but whose spouse is in Australia and they can't travel. And it's been months, and other people are stuck on different sides of borders where they can't be together because of COVID. And that makes it just that much harder. So Sean had been gathering these rules of marriage, And originally as a chaplain, as a rabbi, he thought, I'll make the 10 commandments of marriage because, it's a nice significant number. And for a while we kept trying to fit them into that 10, but eventually he went beyond. So his first one is, marriage is not 50-50. You are each responsible for 100% of the success of your marriage. Do not go somewhere to find a spouse. You would not want your children hanging out. So if you're saying like, I don't want you going, if you would say later in life, I don't want you going there, don't have that be the place where you try to find a spouse. And I will also say that these are his commandments. Neither Sean nor I get all of these right on a regular basis, and some of them we probably never get right. Take 30 minutes with your spouse every day. Date night is also critical, especially after you become parents. We were really bad at that. I will be honest with you. The date night, we were really bad at that. What we did do is we were blessed to have we had really great parents who would take our kids for a long weekend during the year, or maybe even more than a long weekend, but that we were able to take some time that's not at home necessarily. It can be at home, but that's not at home doing the laundry. That's not at home doing the dishes. If it's one thing to have a lovely dinner together and then load the dishwasher, but if you don't have a dishwasher, don't make your date night about doing dishes. That's not date night, unless you happen to really love doing dishes. Some people do, not me. So figure that out.
Does listening to this together count?
Sure. Yeah. You know what? If it's relaxing, you're together, it's not, oh my God, we have to do this, or did you take out the garbage kind of moment, then yes, it counts. It can even be if you both want to curl up on the couch and read a book separately, but you're together. That too is intimate, right? That's taking time to be together, as long as it's understood that you're both comfortable doing that, right? So that's up to you. All right. Here, next is, one rose 12 times will speak more loudly than 12 roses once. Remember the little things and do them often. All right, so I will say, this is the month of Valentine's Day. And Valentine's Day is a day where a lot of people worry about big gifts or a special dinner or whatever. If you can have a special dinner once a month, even if it's at home, even if it's grilled cheese sandwiches, whatever it is, that will be much more meaningful in the long run and significant to your marriage than going out to a big dinner that, especially when kids are younger, means getting things set, finding a babysitter, doing other things, or if you're working, depending, and kids aren't an issue, that you have to say, I have to get home from work, I have to do this, I have to get showered, I have to get ready, I have to get out and go do this. But I would love to just come home, even if it's peanut butter and jelly, sit down, have a relaxing night, and just be with you, right? Because that's important. The most important thing is that the majority of time you like and want to be with your spouse. If you're finding that that is not the case, you need to go and talk to someone who is experienced in marriage counseling. And that's another thing. Marriage counseling does not mean a marriage is bad. Marriage counseling means that you care about a marriage and you want to keep it good. So Sean says, when you get married, you are no longer single. Act married. This means most of your friends, not all, most of your friends should be married people. Do married things. That means not hanging out in bars. And they said, see number 2, which was, don't look for your spouse where you don't want your kids hanging out. Now, you might have a pub where you and your spouse love to hang out with friends. That's okay. But if you're hanging out in a biker bar, that's a different issue. If you're hanging out without your spouse, that's a different issue. Your parents are now second on the priority list. That's sometimes hard to learn, right? Parents often depends on their kids for jobs around the house, doing things for them. They're still gonna want to do that. And that goes on to, in a conflict between your spouse and your spouse always wins. Even if you disagree with your spouse and you let your spouse know that later, in the end, you have to side with your spouse because that's the person you live with. And that's important. Once you've made the decision to be married, act married. Engagement is not your last chance to sow wild oats. So the Hollywood version of the bachelor party. You're going to go out and be crazy and do these things. This is not what someone should be doing while they're engaged. People say, oh, this is your last night as a free person, right? Well, no, as soon as you made the decision to choose someone as your forever person, the night before, that was your night last night as a free. And even the idea of saying free person implies that somehow this is bad, that means I'm not free. But a relationship should be freeing. A relationship should be something where you do feel free and comfortable to do the things that are important to you, and that your spouse is going to bolster you, is going to be happy for you and help you in that. Call, text, or email your spouse from work once a day just to say hello. Yeah, we're not really good with that one either. But it is, what we do, because Sean and I are both rabbis, there actually is a fair amount of email that goes back and forth. And one thing we do make sure to do is, if there is a phone call or an email that has to go and it's about work, I'm aware that I'm, of course, emailing my husband, my spouse, and I'll always sign off with, I love you. And it becomes, on the one hand, routine, but on the other hand, something that you always know you say, and words are important. So being able to say, I love you, and that's not just for spouses, that's for spouses and children and family and good friends, to be able to say those words, I love you. They are very important for people to hear, and they are very meaningful. And there are a lot of people in our world who have trouble with those words. And the only way, if you're one of those people who has trouble with those words, the only way to get comfortable with them is to use them. So I'll say that's something you should definitely do, get used to it. I'm not going to read all of these, but just a couple of others that I think also play into, Rambam's ideals of how we treat people. Always talk about your spouse with respect and love. Don't make jokes about your spouse. This holds when your spouse is present and when your spouse is not present. And never let anyone else talk badly about your spouse. Your spouse always gets your trust. So things like the ball and chain, or can you get away tonight, or that sort of stuff. It shouldn't be part of your life. Say 3 nice things to your spouse every day. Flirt. Sean teaches a class called The Kosher Bedroom, right? And in that, he'll point out that people will talk about chore play. If you've ever heard that phrase, chore play is doing the dishes. So I said date night is not doing the dishes. But if one of you usually does the dishes and is busy doing other things, if you do the dishes, well, I did the dishes, so maybe you can get to bed a little earlier, right? That's called chore play. I'm helping you I'm helping you out here so we can be together later, even if that means that you're going to fall asleep reading a book because you're very tired tonight, but at least we can be together. The last one I'm going to do 2 more. First, your spouse cannot read your mind. Tell your spouse what you're thinking, and you can't read your spouse's mind, so ask. Which is, again, and like I said, We're not always good with these things, but we work at them. And the last one is laugh and sing together. The last one I'm going to share right now is laugh and sing it together. Because in the end, I think we'll go back to that text of Breshit, where Isaac and Rebecca are seen in that garden, and the verb that's used there is matzrik, that they're playing. They're playing together. Couples should be playful. You don't have to be serious all the time. It's hard. It's hard. It's hard when we're doing the same day over and over again. You know, it's February 3rd. Yesterday was Groundhog's Day. You know, Groundhog Day. And there were a whole bunch of articles in the newspaper about the movie Groundhog Day, but doing that same day over and over again. Normal life can feel that way, right? Wake up in the morning, go to work, get through your day, make dinner, do the dishes, go to bed, get up in the morning, you know. But with COVID, I think a lot of us are checking our calendar saying, what day is today? And how is today different than yesterday? Those things are hard. If you can use Jewish tradition, use Shabbat to mark your days. That's actually a really good time. Our tradition has always said that marital intimacy is important, but on Shabbat, it receives an extra level of Kedusha, which is a really interesting statement. When a whole lot of the world was saying that sex was somehow dirty and sinful, that Judaism was saying not only is it not those things, but it's beautiful. And on Shabbat of all days, on the holiest day of the week, that's when you should be intimate, because it adds your intimacy actually adds another layer of holiness to your marriage and to Shabbat. Use that. Use that to spend a little extra time together. If you can take that time and play a game as a family, as a couple, you know, if you can take that time, as I said, sit on the couch together and read a book and just be close to each other so that you're moving. I started talking about how couples move in each other's space, so that you're moving in each other's space and you're staying in each other's space. It's one more way to renew that intimacy. And Shabbat is a perfect time for that. We're a little over time, but I want to find out if there are any questions or comments that anyone wants to make.
No, that was great. That was really helpful. I mean, it's stuff I feel like we've heard before, but I need to hear it probably once a week because then I forget. Need the constant reminder. And yeah, especially as you mentioned, after having kids,
Yeah,
you're exhausted.
yes. With young kids especially, it's really hard. And it's different with teenagers, and now with my kids are all essentially grown, but any couple needs the reminder. Like I said, Sean has these 21 rules. We're not so great at it. Actually, it's good for us to pull up that blog entry from 2011 every once in a while and go, oh yeah, that's funny. Never do that. You know, like it's on your rules, and we never do that. But the reminders are important, right?
Yeah. No, I know. I listened to it with our mom's group. We had a speaker talk about marriage a month ago. And it's just like, like every time we hear it, like, of course, it makes sense. You know, this whole renewed, like, I don't know, ambition to be better. So thank you. This helped. We needed it today.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
And I'd say, you know, if you could pick one thing that you guys try and do once a week, that's so
Yeah.
small steps. I'll say that's actually it, because you're right. It's a lot of stuff and it's hard to remember. Small steps, one thing once a week that you can do together, that can make all the difference in the long run.
Thanks very much. It was great. Even after 46 years, it's still important.
Wow.
Great.
That's awesome.
46 is a good number.
Yeah.
We'll get there. We'll get there eventually. That's the goal. That'd be, you know, when I think about my grandparents who were married, I remember us celebrating their 70th anniversary at a big party.
Crazy.
Yeah. So, you know, the goal is, you know, that and beyond. So we'll see.
Yeah.
So everyone should be well. And
Yeah.
if anyone has any
Thank you.
questions, of course, they can always get me after. Chloe, I'll send you the the links and the recording.
Perfect.
Okay. And
Okay.
it's nice to see the faces and to know there are a couple of
Yeah.
people whose faces that I can't see, but to know you're
Yeah.
there.
Well, yeah, there was another face. She just signed off shortly, but yeah,
Okay.
amazing. Okay.
Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Well,
Thank you.
see
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.